you probably know this about Zoom, it warns everybody now. Welcome to Firecat First Friday. I'm so glad that you have made time for us in your schedule this Friday, the first Friday in August. Firecat Studio does user experience consulting and design, usability research, and marketing, digital marketing strategy. So we love doing all kinds of things that help digital experiences be better for the human beings involved in the experiences. And today, one of the experiences that I know you're all familiar with, hopefully that's why you're here, is surveys. Firecat just finished working on a project for the San Antonio Police Department, where we did a big survey of what people wanted from their police department in San Antonio, Texas, where we're located, what they wanted to consume in terms of information that the police department published about their activities, and also just studying the lines of communication in the digital realm. It was fascinating. And I got to see 2 surveys as part of that. We also did focus groups, interviews, accessibility testing, but the 2 surveys being designed by 2 different sets of people was just fascinating. And it really opened my eyes at how much of an art form survey design is and how important it is to very carefully strategize every step of the way. Then the genesis of this this session, right after we did those surveys, Caroline Jarrett, who is one of our speakers today, came out with this book, Surveys That Work with Rosenfeld Media. And Lou Rosenfeld is one of my contacts, and I love him and all the stuff that he publishes. And so when he publishes a book, he's got the expert on it almost every time. Some of my favorite UX books are from Rosenfeld Media. I am going to send you guys a link to get the book at a 30% discount, thanks to Lou and his team. We're also joined by Lily Casura. She is a dear friend of mine that we've known each other for several years now, 10, 12, something like that. Lily is a lifelong student and she masters things, but she's always looking to master the next thing. She's in a PhD program right now. Lily, you want to talk a little bit about that? I'm going to get your background wrong if I'm not careful.
So yeah, the program is in applied demography, which is essentially very data heavy analysis. I just felt like it was a great thing to do to deepen the knowledge that I've been gaining over the years and stuff like that.
And then Caroline, will you introduce yourself just a little bit more?
Yeah, so I'm describe myself as the form specialist. So I advise organizations on how to make forms easy to fill in and business processes that involve forms more effective. And, you know, if Lily's knowledge of data analysis and using large data sets is deep, mine is at the other end. I'm your shallow data girl, you know. If I can calculate a mode, a range for my results, that's usually good enough for me. But I sort of got sucked into surveys because I was looking for the literature on forms. You know, I was searching to find out where was all this marvelous stuff that I could find out to help me design better forms. And I discovered that kind of no one researches forms. I mean, you know, you can see my bookshelves behind me. My forms bookshelf is like, yay. And so I started to look for other people who could help me with problems like how do people answer questions and how do you design a question so that people can answer it accurately, which is obviously crucial in constructing a good form conversation. You know, we want people to give accurate answers and to give them easily. And poof, my world exploded when I discovered the enormous amount of literature on surveys. So, you know, survey methodology has been a thing for at least 150 years, you know, and hundreds and hundreds of papers are published every year on surveys. Quality of textbooks on survey design is enormous. And so I sort of really started to discover that I needed to learn something about surveys. And then my mentor, Ginny Reddish, by the way, if you haven't got Ginny's book, Letting Go of the Words, buy it now. Ginny is the best at everything to do with writing. And I'm honored to be her mentee. And she kind of said, oh, you have to write a book on surveys now. And I said, okay, Ginny, because that's what you do when Ginny gives you an instruction, you just crack on. And a mere 11 years later, I'm done. I'm published. So there you go. And that's basically because I didn't know as much about surveys as I needed to. I had to find out more. That was one thing. And some life happened. Some of it was dramatic. And so I say, well, I've got good excuses and bad excuses and inexcusable delays for why it took me so long. But I think it's a better book, you know, so that's how I've ended up with a book. But I guess my role in our conversation is I'm the survey skeptic, and I think Lily is the survey enthusiast. So
you're both omnivorous about information. That's one thing I've learned. We've had a couple of discussion times now, and that's something you definitely share. The book, if you're interested in this book, I cannot recommend it highly enough. Lily and I have both dived into it, and I know some of you say in the chat that you have as well. If you use this code at Rosenfeld Media, it will give you 30% off. So I'm not trying to flog the book too hard, but
no, flog.
What I came to is I thought I knew a fair amount about it, and there's always a better way, and this details a bunch of better way. So let's see.
Susan,
yes,
can I say something? So I feel like I need to go into what my background is in becoming a survey believer. When I was in college, I went to Harvard a million years ago, and I had a gig working for the business school, compiling the results of a survey they sent to a bunch of attendees every semester. Really excellently done, and it was a great experience. Was part of a horrible survey, also a Harvard thing, where they figured that all high achieving women were secret anorexics. And so they sent me surveys for about 20 years, literally just trying to push me into saying yes. And I thought, man, this thing is so poorly designed. And then I got involved in things having to do with veterans. And we have about 2 million women veterans in the United States, but they're left out of most conversations about veterans. So we have a very Rambo outlook on that. It's all the kind of go-getter guy thing. And it turned out that a lot of women veterans are homeless, especially after sexual assault in the military, which is also far too prevalent. So one year I thought, well, I'll become, I'll be part of the volunteers who go out and find people who are homeless and be part of that point in time count every January. And I thought more about it. And I thought, based on what I know so far, I'll never run across women veterans this way, because this is not where they spend time or how it works for them. They're kind of hidden from all that. And so I basically thought, how do you get them to tell you their stories? And I realized, use a survey. And so I did a very seat of the pants thing and got women veterans to talk me through what the concepts were and the phrasing, and we pilot tested it. And man, we had like 400 responses in about 24 hours. So it showed me that there was really a need for that. And that when you turn to the experts about their own lived experiences, you get great results. So that's kind of what started me on the believer track.
Yay.
And I just really love that, because in like 3 sentences, Lily has summed up so much best practice, right? She talked about really respecting the experience of the users, total best practice. She talked about interviewing people so that you understand the way they talk about it and extracting more of those conversations, total best practice. She talked about piloting the survey, right? Making sure every aspect of it works. And, you know, I haven't met Lily for long, but I'm pretty willing to bet that that piloting included some trial analysis and thinking about how would you extract and present the results. Am I right, Lily? You know, really thinking through the entire process. Yeah. And so, you know, this is when you speak with an expert, you get boom, 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 just taking for granted lots of things which in practice I find that many of my clients aren't doing. They're often thinking survey first, not interview first. They're often asking the questions that they want to ask, not listening, you know, which I call the most crucial question. What's the question you want to ask? I call the most crucial question. But Lily put in a lot of effort to find out what I call the burning issue, which is what do people want to tell you, you know? And so when you find someone who's running a great survey, you hear all this great best practice, but a lot of my clients just say, oh, I'm going to do a survey, have a look at this questionnaire, and they think nothing about the other things that are going on.
That's brilliant.
There's a couple of really important points that I wanted to make sure we covered in what you just said, Caroline. And one is, when do you use a survey as opposed to some other user research method?
Well, you know, one of the things that I would say is I wouldn't use the as opposed to, you know, I would say that a survey has to be part of a suite of methods. You know, it can surprise people when I say, you know, you actually get to doing your survey by doing some interviewing, and you might be doing some usability testing. You know, you have to usability test your survey just like any other digital product or non-digital product. You know, even if it's I spent the first third of my career testing paper forms and computers which were before the internet. So, you know, we've got these skills as UXers, we've got skills about products that we create, and we need to bring those skills to our survey as well. You know, right? So part of it is using our UX skills to develop a great survey. And part of it is thinking about what are the things that you can learn from a survey that you can, as we would call it, triangulate. I guess that's a familiar idea, you know, comparing the results of the survey from other methods. Can we triangulate here to compare what we've learned maybe from analytics, what we've learned from maybe calls to our call center, what we're learning in our usability testing and our other research? Okay, well, where can a survey actually fill in those gaps? So it's not, to me, it's not in opposition, it's comparing data we're getting from other sources. You know, that would be probably, that's one of the key messages in my book. I have chapter 1, which is about goals, and half of it is about thinking what you want to learn from the survey, but the other part of it is about keeping that research in context with other methods that you might be using. Yeah.
You talked about in the book doing interviews first, which is what we did in the police department stuff. And I found that was a good way to help our team formulate what we wanted to know. And Lily, I think you've done the same thing.
Yeah, I guess I would say not just what you want to know, but how you need to ask it, because your population understands how they frame those questions and answers. And so it's crucial to know that. And you see too much stuff that's out there where it's clear a committee worked on it and they're just asking what they want to know. I think to your last point about like, why do you use this as a suite, in the suite of tools that you have? I think one reason is you want to go deeper. Either the knowledge is not really out there, the information about the experience, there's a need to go deeper and get past the shallow level of understanding about it. So women, veterans, and homelessness, nobody was even thinking that women veterans were homeless. So you need to change the narrative. And to do that, you have to go deeper and let the people who are affected talk about their experience themselves. And so that goes into what you were just saying. It's not, I mean, we're not the experts on other people's lived experiences. They are. And when there's some commonality, trying to figure out how to draw that out using people who are key players in that population. People who have lived the experience, understand it, know how to talk about it. And in the case of things that are traumatic, have enough distance on something so that they can actually give you the value of what they understand from it, but you're not going to send them down a negative path for them by asking them to talk about it.
One of the things that I was surprised about when Lily was telling me about some of the survey work that she'd been doing is I tend to think of surveys as primarily a quantitative research method. And the reason we use surveys often is to get to a whole bunch of people and get a whole bunch of data. But what Lily is able to do is dive into some of these more nuanced questions. And in talking to these two smart ladies, I realized all of the surveys we do mix. There's quantitative and qualitative. You know, it's how well did you like it is quantitative, but what could we do better is qualitative. And almost every survey is a mix of those things.
Yes. I think that's true, but also I think as you know, my background's in user research, and I tend to reach for my qualitative methods first. And so I do also make the point that it is about getting a number. You know, if you don't need a number at the end, and from what I was hearing about Lily's survey when we met previously, there was power in the number as well. You know, I said, oh, so you use this vein as a tool for qualitative thing. And Lily said, no, you know, it was about getting really solid numbers as well. So generally, I urge people to keep sight of the idea that you're going to end up with a number as the result of your survey. What number do you want to use to make a decision? What would be a useful number? But I fully agree that you can incorporate some qualitative feedback, and that could be very rich. It could be people's lived experience, or it could be quite light touch. You know, I talk about light touch surveys, and one of the little tools that someone introduced me to, and I've now forgotten who told me that years ago, so I apologize to that person. It wasn't my idea, but it was a good one, was to just ask people for 3 words. So please give us word 1, word 2, word 3, and that can give some quite nuanced replies. You know, people can mix and match their words, or sometimes they just give us, you know, great, you know, or awful, which really emphasizes it, or they can say good, medium, and bad, you know, in the 3 words. And it's a little bit trivial almost, but it does give an opportunity to collect something that bridges that gap between getting fairly hefty stories, which are great and I love them, and the sort of numbers that can be a little soulless as well. From my point of view as a user researcher, I like to hear the stories behind. So, you know, there are quite a number of different tools that we can use to add nuance and deeper reflection. But mainly I'm kind of cutting big surveys down to little ones is one of the things I'm doing a lot of in my professional work. Yeah.
Lily, I know that your survey had a sort of flow to it. I took the survey. It was one of the surveys Lily designed, and it was a domestic violence survey for the county that I live in. And it was a long survey, but it was engrossing in a way. Can you talk a little bit about how you made that happen?
Well, that's really nice to hear, because I mean, bottom line, if you want to get results, you have to create, I wouldn't say a pleasurable experience, because I mean, you're talking about heavy stuff sometimes, but pleasant enough that it's engaging and that the person wants to make it to the end. Because probably like Caroline, I leave the open-ended stuff for someone to share to the end of the survey. But in order to get them there, you know, you can't penalize them along the way and make it really difficult. So I think flow of questions really matters. But, you know, here's an obvious thing that should be practiced more. Don't talk down to people. You're not above them because you're surveying them. And if you create in them a feeling that you're manipulating them or using them, or just, you know, quick, let me extract what I need to know here and then dispose of you, the survey respondent, I think that comes across. And I try to make sure that the stuff that I work on really values the respondent and creates that feeling and carries it throughout. It feels like very little to do to thank them and appreciate them for what they're doing, and not just in a cursory way, but to treat them as a valued respondent throughout. And I think you get great results that way.
And conversely, I think we've all seen the survey invitation that's been thoughtlessly sent to us, which says something like, we value your opinion, and they don't value my opinion. All they want to know is the extent to which I agree or disagree with the opinions they want to put to me.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
So that's the sort. I mean, we're hearing about best practice and how great the survey can be from Lily. And I suppose I got conditioned by the surveys that were really rubbish. You know, for one client, I had to fight my way through 25 minutes of questions on deodorant. And I'm just really not that interested in deodorant, you know. And so it was like, it took quite a lot of interviews for me when I started on the book with people like Lily, other colleagues in UX who, well, Lily's survey is not necessarily user experience, but I interviewed people who I knew were doing surveys, particularly user experience colleagues who were doing surveys, to really understand some of the value that I could get in like the sort of more everyday type of thing, rather as opposed to something which is, if I put at one end, you know, the kind of throwaway, almost please rate your most recent purchase piece, right through to the fully supported, really thoughtfully, brilliantly designed investigation of a serious topic like women, veterans, homelessness, or domestic violence. I feel that there's an area in between, which is something where we can do a lot better. You know, we're not all in a position to do a really fantastic, important piece of work, but on the other hand, we could do better than some of the thoughtless stuff that we're shoving in front of some of our users, colleagues, clients, and so on. So I'm kind of more at the let's improve the inevitable survey type of end. And then what I really hope, another of my ambitions for the book, is people will become enthusiastic enough to want to go out and engage with some of the amazing, wonderful works that there are. I mean, some of the books on survey methodology that I've read, I just love, and I really enjoy recommending to people. So there's that aspect of it as well. It's like I'm hoping to lure people in to want to engage more with the sort of literature that they might want to study in order to do something as fantastic as Lily's or Susan's work.
I've had a question in the Q&A that wants you guys to riff more on how to encourage engagement in surveys. One of the things that I remember I'm retaining, this is a good sign for me that I'm reading this kind of stuff and I'm retaining some of the tips. One of the ones I really liked was, stop asking, can we have a few minutes of your time? Why don't you just, this is from Caroline's book, why don't you just pop up a really interesting question? Just do quick hits. That was great. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, I get an awful lot of pop-ups, things which ask me the question, are you interested, you know, are you willing to answer this survey? And we already have adequate data on the fact that most people, like 99.9% of people, the answer to that is no. We have enough data on that. We don't need to collect any more data that people don't want to answer your survey. So at least let's ask them an interesting question. You know, like I have answered the question, and I've heard colleagues talk about this. Why did you come to this website today? Yeah, that's something you can answer. Was this page helpful? You know, to be honest, I rarely. I'm not going to fib to you here. I rarely answer that when it's been meh. You know, I might answer if it's good page, and I might answer if it's not helped me. But at least I've answered, you know, that's something that's salient. So thinking about a useful, salient question can inspire people to perhaps be more engaged. And then, you know, if you really, really do need to do something that's going to require perhaps something that's quite personal or a challenging topic or might elicit painful memories, there's no shortcuts on that. You have to work at it. You have to do all the things that Lily was talking about really understanding that problem space. You know, if you're working in those sort of areas that might be very personal, very painful, you owe it to your users, to the people who are going to respond, to respect their time and do all of those proper preparatory steps to get it right.
Yeah, very much so. I think when you talk about engagement, there's kind of two parts to it. One is, how do you get people to participate in the survey to start with, and make sure that they're a pretty representative group, not just people with a bad attitude who want to spend some time telling you what they think, because they're out there and they also love to answer surveys. And then engagement within the survey itself, like stay engaged, make it to the end, have a good experience with it. So that's one thing. But I think also within a survey itself, don't burden people with, as Caroline was saying, stuff you don't need to ask them in the first place, just because you've seen it on your Google searches of surveys. One of the things that I'm somewhat against is asking too much about people's economic status and their educational status. I think that can be very pejorative in some ways. And frankly, you don't need to know that. You do if you want to make a case for, this is a problem that crosses all these lines and look how we can justify that. That's all true. But if you're going to use that, don't put it at the beginning of your survey, and don't make the beginning of your survey boring, because people will drop out and then they won't even get to the meat of why you're doing this in the first place. So I try to be very tactical or strategic, I guess, about how to present that and save some of the boring stuff for the end. I mean, we did that on the domestic violence survey. Race and ethnicity is at the absolute end. If you get to it, you get to it. But, you know, we wanted to know other things first.
And you didn't ask questions that you could find out another way, is one of the things I heard you say. And that's so important. The length of the survey. I mean, I'm sure we've all experienced survey fatigue where you wade in there. Pew Internet is kind of like that for me. I love their surveys and I love the research that they and the insights that they generate. And I want to be part of that. I'm very highly motivated, but it's a big ask. I have to craft my answers. I go in the first time and find all the questions, then put them into a document so that I can craft my answers and then put it back. And they actually tell you to do that. So it's a huge investment, and not asking questions you don't need to know from them right that minute, or that you can find out another way, and then ruthlessly reducing, right? Content strategy is always about this. It's easy to publish a lot of stuff. It's harder to publish very concise, useful nuggets, right? So another area that I would love for you guys to delve into before we open up for audience questions. We got a good audience here, and I'm sure they have good questions. I would love for you guys to talk about sampling. How do you determine who you're going to ask? Because for me, it's very relevant to marketing strategy and segmenting. So why don't you guys take a stab at telling me, how do you decide who you want to respond to your survey?
Do you want me to go first, Lily, or do you have a go first?
You can. That's a tough one.
Okay, so from my world, which is sort of edging people from the thoughtless surveys into ones that might be useful, you know, often a client will say to me, oh, well, it could be anyone, it's the web. And then I say, well, okay, will it be my 8-year-old nephew? And oh no, okay. So we've eliminated kids, you know, okay. You know, what about, I'm very proud to have a distant relative who lives in Sudan. Oh, okay. What about people in Sudan? I'm like, maybe not. Well, okay, now we're getting towards a bit of a definition, you know, so sort of challenging that it could be everyone, and really getting people, you know, I talk a lot in the book about the defined group of people, right? Who exactly is in your defined group of people? What is the definition of them? We can loosely say customers. Well, does customers include, let's say you're Rosenfeld Media. Do your customers include people who've been sent a complimentary copy of the book because they're going to review it? Is that person a customer? Does that customer include a student who's been assigned the book as a class project? Are they a customer or not? Does your customer list include people? One of the things that I'm very sorry if this is triggering for anybody, but in today's world, one of the things we have to think about is what happens if a customer is too sick at the moment. Do they count as a customer we want to bother? So actually really thinking about, what about new customers? What about people who've just joined? Do we want them to reflect on their last 8 years experience with you when they've just signed up for their very first thing? So actually thinking about what we really mean is hard work, because people don't want to put that effort in, but it also helps. The more precise you can be about your audience, the better. Okay. And so I want to hear as well, from Lily, about some of the things you did to decide whether a person counted as being a woman veteran, for example, in responding to your survey. Was that an easy definition, or did you have to think it through?
So great question. That one went through 2 iterations. And on the first one, 10% of the respondents were men, even though the thing said women everywhere. And the whole reason for doing the research is women aren't heard from on this topic. But I couldn't get men to stop wanting to tell their stories too. So on the second one, I wrote in some code that if you said you were a guy, you just didn't get to take the survey. You just got to the thank you page at the end. But my stuff is probably oriented to adults. And I either, in that case, don't want guys to have something to say, but on the domestic violence, absolutely do. And I think one thing that I try to really focus on is making sure there's a wide distribution so that the most available people who fit the model that I'm looking for to take the survey get exposed to it, and work through people who almost broker it to their populations. But a big thing that I do throughout, because I want to make sure that geographically the stuff is representational. And so I'm always asking for zip code, and then I'm plugging it into Excel and plugging it into Tableau and doing a literal display of, are people coming from all the places that they should? And in some cases, what we have here is we can compare that, for example, against census data. And so for women veterans, when I asked them where they lived, and I found out, wow, they're a lot focused in the Southeast, that's interesting. Then it turned out it was a perfect match for where women veterans are located in the US. So you end up learning something through that. Some of the work I've done locally, distribution of zip codes, make sure everybody in the county is participating in something. And if they're not, you need to work harder while the survey is ongoing to get that participation. But to me, that's a great backstop to check your work as you go, essentially.
When you're doing a survey and the analysis, you need to think like a data scientist, planning and operating and then doing your insights. I learned a lot about data science. I worked for a startup called Anaconda that is, they do a lot of Python open source coding, and that mindset of exploring the data and finding multiple, there's so much data that is available to us that you might not know about. So what I'm hearing, the common thread in everything both of you are saying is you give it a lot of thought. Just like any good design, you don't just rush out there and put in a Likert scale. I learned that Likert is how you pronounce that. We had a question about Likert scales. Let me see if I can find that. Can you touch on survey configuration relating to Likert scale data versus non-Likert scale data? What percentage of questions are binary, yes, no? Are there other methodologies or scales to help define clustering?
Wow, that's about 3 questions in one question. So I'm going to go a little technical and a little purist here and say that there's 2 things that get very much muddled up together, really. And this is not this is like the world. This isn't saying, oh, you've got this muddled up. It's like, in general, people use the term Likert scale for what is purest as a Likert scale and what I would call a Likert item, but doesn't necessarily have a same thing. So when you say, one of the questions that I get asked a lot is, what's the right number of points in a Likert scale? So that's where you have a question like, are you enjoying this webinar or this conversation? And then you give people a scale where 0 is not at all through to, and you might say 1 is not at all through to 5 is a great deal. Yeah. So this is referred to in a lot of literature, even in peer-reviewed papers, as a Likert scale. But from a sort of more purist point of view, Mr. Likert, in his famous 1932 paper, his Likert scale consisted of a number of those sort of format questions, and then he took all the answers and added them up to get one number. So the scale consisted of a number of things, which each of which was what I would call a Likert item. And I stick to calling it a Likert item and a Likert scale to distinguish between the individual bit and the dozen things. So for us in user experience, one of the most common Likert scales that many of us will have encountered is the system usability scale, SUS. It's a very commonly used questionnaire to assess whether people think something is usable, and it's got 10 items, and my brain is failing me to remember any of them, but I put it in the book anyway. It's quite a useful scale, and it's got items in it, basically typical questions you might ask someone about usability. So I've now forgotten the question because I went off on a purist riff. I'm so sorry.
No.
I think it was something about, you know, the Likert items. When do you use Likert items compared to yes, no questions compared to other things?
Mm-hmm.
Is that about right?
That's about right.
Yeah. So yeah, go on, Lily.
I'm going to come in with a slightly different read on that too, which is there's a million ways to ask people about something that you want to know. And then there's the native ways that they're going to understand how that gets framed. And I find that doing your homework and figuring out how people refer to this, what they group it with, what you need to group it with externally for other reasons, like in the women, veterans, and homelessness stuff, on the second take, I knew that I wanted to match what studies that Department of Defense did. So I ordered things in certain ways so that they would match exactly. And again, that's like thinking of the analysis part when you're framing it. But I find multiple choice questions are just fantastic, especially if you're limiting the options to what the most common choices would be. So you do your homework and you figure out the way that most people are going to answer this question is they're going to use one of these 4 options. You give them those 4 options, maybe even in order of likelihood so that they can move quicker through the survey. And then you give them another category and you let them say what that is if it's important enough to include. And sometimes you find that people just give you the same answers back from the 4 choices, which kind of questionable why that happens. And other times they use it just extraordinarily well. On the domestic violence survey that I'm currently running, there's a question about if you didn't seek help, like so you've gone through domestic violence, but if you didn't seek help at the time, what was your reason for not seeking help? And that comes at the end of a few questions, which would set up like, I did this, I talked to this person, whatever. So then you've got a group of people who didn't, for whatever reason, do something. And you want to find out what their barriers were, but not shame them through doing it. And on that one, we got hundreds and hundreds of people using the other category and saying something that actually was valuable. So it's like, it's just, to me, remarkable how this experience goes and how organic it can be. Certain things really interest people to talk about. And it's not so much the form that you're using. They could hardly participate on the same structure of a question that you asked 2 questions ago, but they get to this one and they really have something to say about it. And it's just incredible what happens. So you can often have both experiences in the same survey.
What she said. Like it's not so much, it's what will be comfortable for people to answer and fits what they want to tell you. And I really want to pick out the other. One of the things that I do in my work on forms, and just as much as in surveys, but I basically, I'm going to make stickers that say no, yes, no. And no, yes, no means do not have questions with only a yes and no answer, because the real world just is analog. The real world always has richer stories than the ones we can think about. So, in forms design work in government, which is what I do mostly, I'm saying, always put an extra option on. Now, you don't always call it other, because, for example, if we look at the sensitive topic of people's gender identities, it can be very distressing for people who don't fit neatly into our two most boring gender identities. If you make them tick a box called other, you might want to call it something else, or your preference, or you have to not always use the word other, but you can use a variety of ways that are not just yes and no to allow people to express a different answer. And then when you pilot it, if nobody ever chooses that extra option, then you might consider dropping it off. If loads of people choose that extra option when you pilot it, you might want to think of a richer set of responses. So you've got so much flexibility when you pilot it. Or in the world of government forms, we talk about putting things in public beta or private beta. So I would say I would always want to keep that extra option available, at least through my beta test phases until it goes live. And then you can drop it off and you consider, one of the things I do talk about in the analysis stage is, sometimes you just do get other responses. I remember analysing a survey where I had 19,000 responses from Open University, which is our biggest university in the UK, which is a distance learning university. And we were doing a survey of whether students were willing to use Facebook in connection with their studies. And, we asked the question, do you have a Facebook account? And we asked yes, no, and other. And we did get some other responses. And one of the other responses was, I'm from People's Republic of China, where Facebook is banned, but that was like 1 in 19,000. So we just put it as an exception. It didn't really affect our analysis. So sometimes you just do get some very unusual things and you just deal with them in a different way. So you don't need to be thinking, oh, if I put an extra option on, I'm going to be overwhelmed. You can find out, whether there's richer stories, like in Lily's example, which you'll find out in piloting. You can find out where there's scarcely any other things. You can find out you don't need it at all and take it off when it comes to the final survey. But really, the kind of no, yes, no is a bit of a slogan for me. So there's so much on question types. I mean, it was a cracking question, and I'm not sure we fully answered it, but at least we've sort of riffed around some of the issues. So it was a great question. Thank you.